Um, I'll just introduce Rachel Davies from the Freshwater Leeches recording scheme. So, Rachel, over to you to tell us about the cousins of earthworms, our leeches.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kieran. Thank you very much for having me here tonight. As Kieran said, I'm Rachel and I run the Freshwater Leech recording scheme. So the recording scheme is relatively new. It was established earlier this year in 2024, and it's a collaboration between myself and a fellow leech lover, Craig McAdam. So me and Craig met each other a couple of years ago. We were working together and we realised that we both loved leeches, and we decided to collaborate and write the guide to freshwater leeches for the Field Studies Council. And it was as we were coming to the end of the guide that we decided it would be nice to have a recording scheme to encourage more people to look at leeches. So we were able to secure a grant from the Tanupta Trust to host a website and to pay for a few training days. And we're just hoping that through the recording scheme, we can get more people to love leeches. So it's great to be here tonight and hopefully convert a few of you by the end of this short talk. So when we think of leeches in the UK, most people will think of this leech, which is the medicinal leech. Medicinal leeches are known because of our history with the species and how we used to use them for bloodletting. They're a medically significant species, and the reason for that is because they're able to blood feed on mammals, particularly humans, and they've been really useful to us throughout history. The medicinal leech is now, unfortunately, very rare in the UK, but when we talk about leeches, this is the one that most people will think about. And actually, it's caused quite a stigma with leeches. A lot of people can be quite scared of them, and they assume that all leeches are going to suck blood. But in reality, in the UK, we actually have 17 different species of leech. And the families for these leeches are on this slide. So leeches in the UK split into two orders, and the difference between the orders is basically one order, the Rhycobdelidae, and they are the jawless leeches, and the Aryncobdelidae are the jawed leeches. So it's just a difference in the way they feed. So the jawless leeches are the Piscolidae, which are fish leeches, and the Glossophonidae, and they have 2 and 8 species respectively. And then in the jawed leeches, we have the Earthworm, which have 5 species, Hemophidae, which has 1 species, and then Hirudinae, the medicinal leech group, which is 1 species. So out of these 17 species, it's only really the medicinal leech that feeds on mammals. There is one other species that feeds on mammals, but not as frequently. And the rest of them feed on a whole host of other organisms. Some will feed on amphibians, some feed on fish, and some will engulf their prey. So although leeches have this reputation for being bloodsuckers of humans, that's not true. So before I talk a bit more about leeches, let's just compare leeches and earthworms, because they are closely related, and every now and again people can make a confusion. So the main differences between earthworms and leeches is the suckers. So earthworms have a sucker, one either end, a posterior and an anterior sucker, and earthworms do not. Although both leeches and earthworms are segmented, an earthworm can have a varied number of segments ranging from 37 to 100, whereas leeches will always have a set number of segments, which is 34. Another great feature to distinguish between an earthworm and a leech is the presence of eyes. So leeches have visible eyes in a particular arrangement, and as long as you have the right magnification, you will be able to see those eyes, whereas earthworms do not have eyes. And then lastly, one of the main ways that you can tell them apart, particularly in the field, is their movement. So earthworms move through expansion and contraction, whereas leeches move in a very characteristic looping motion. So for anyone who's a visual learner, this slide just shows the main features of an earthworm that we use to distinguish from a leech. So you can see no sucker, no eyes. Although they have segmentation, earthworms have setae, which leeches do not. And on adult earthworms, you'll always see this clitellum or the saddle. If we switch over to leeches, we see again they're segmented, but they don't have setae. They do have a sucker on either end, and with the right magnification, you'll see their eyes, which are either 1 pair or 5 pairs. Well, between 1 to 5 pairs. You will occasionally see leeches with a catellum, but it's only a few species that have this visible, and it's only during the breeding season. So that can cause a little bit of confusion, but generally you should not see a leech with a saddle. Okay, so if we pop back to those 17 species in the UK, compared to earthworms, that's not too much, I guess, and maybe half. 17 species may seem a lot, but it is actually quite manageable because one of the great things about leeches is with using their eyes, you can straight away take them to family level identification. So every family has a distinctive number of eyes and an arrangement of eyes. So if you can get the right magnification, so some people can do this with a hand lens, others may need a microscope, but as long as you're looking for those eyes, then straight away you can do family level ID, which is great. Everybody likes a bit of easy ID, and leeches definitely fit that bill to family level. Once we move past this and we want to look at species level ID, there's actually 7 species, so that's nearly half of all leeches that we can do in the field, which I think is fantastic. One of the problems some beginners might have with leeches is that they typically don't have common names. So a couple of the more popular leeches have a common name, like the horse leech and the medicinal leech, but the majority of them don't. So getting your tongue around the scientific names can be a little bit difficult to start with. But with the field ID, you can use the FSC guide that myself and Craig produced, which I'm just holding up to the camera there. And what this guide does is it looks at some of the more obvious features that are easy to see. So for example, we might be looking at the coloration of a leech. So some leeches have a pigmentation in the skin, and this is really useful for field identification. Other leeches, such as the third one in this slide, Hemiclepsis marginata, they have an enlarged head, and that again, coupled with the eye arrangement, can be really useful for species level ID. And then we have one leech, Hippobdella stagnalis, which has a scute on the equivalent of its neck, and a scute is a hardened plate, and we only have one species with that hardened plate, and it's normally always visible to the eye. So again, field ID is looking at quite obvious features, and once you get your eye in and you look at a couple of leeches, you can really start to be confident in what you're doing in the field. The other 10 species of leech in the UK are slightly more tricky, and these do require microscope ID. And that is because normally you can roughly tell them apart in pairs, but going past it, you need to look at some smaller features such as the papillae, which are raised bumps on the skin, the genital pores, which are found on the dorsal side of the leech, or other small features such as annulation, which is a pattern that can be found on each segment. But overall, out of 17 species, nearly half can be done in the field, and then we have fantastic keys to take the rest of them to species level with a microscope. And the 2 main resources we use are the field guide from the Field Studies Council and the key from Elliott and Dobson that was published by the Freshwater Biological Association. It's a dichotomous key, it's fantastic to use, and it has some great diagrams, and coupled with a field guide which has some great photographs, together they really make looking at leeches really good fun. So although we have 17 species in the UK, rather than go into them into any more detail than I already have, I wanted to briefly talk about some new leeches that we found in the UK. So the first leech I'm going to briefly touch upon is Batrachopdella algira, and this first appeared in the UK in 2020. And the second leech I'll be talking about is Barbronia werberi, and this leech has been discovered in the UK this year directly as a result of the recording scheme. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So firstly, let's look at Batrachopdella algira. This leech was discovered in 2020 when people started to notice amphibians with a rather unusual feeding pattern upon them. So they were finding leeches that were particularly fond of feeding on the eyes and the throat of amphibians. This behaviour hadn't really been recorded in the UK prior to 2020. And so photos started circulating and interested parties wanted to find out what was happening. So Craig McAdam, along with several other scientists, looked into it further, and they discovered that there were reports of this feeding behaviour at 41 different sites between 2020 to 23. And these 41 sites were spread between the Isle of Wight, Hampshire, Devon, Greater London, and Somerset. So they did a lot of complex DNA work, a lot of morphological ID on specimens, and they found that out of those 5 different counties, 3 of them had correctly recorded Batrachopdella algira. So again, with some more DNA work, they discovered that it was very, very similar genetically to a Tunisian version of Batrachopdella algira, and it's looking like it was likely introduced. However, because nobody really noticed it until 2020, it's hard to know if it was in the country beforehand. So there is a small chance that it could be arriving here through natural long-range dispersal, but we don't know. So they're looking into this in more detail, and they've just released a fantastic paper, which is titled on this slide. I'm sure somebody will Google that shortly and drop a link in the chat. But if you want to read more about that, you can. And this species is partly one of the reasons we looked at establishing a recording scheme, because this is fascinating behaviour that's been recorded, and fascinating that we've found a new species in the UK. And we established a recording scheme, obviously, in 2024, so a couple of years after this discovery. But we always had in the back of our minds that maybe if we encourage more people to look at leeches, then we might get lucky and find something else new. We didn't expect it to happen only months after launching the scheme. And that takes us to the River Lee in London, and our other species of note, Barbronia werberei. So when we established a recording scheme, I sent a note out to a few friends saying I needed specimens for our workshops, and that if people had leeches, they could send them in to me. We'd identify them, provide a species list, and then the specimens would be used for teaching. So Gino Brignoli, he's part of the Earthworm Society. He works at Cody Dock as the biodiversity officer, and each month he goes out with a team of volunteers to do riverfly sampling on the River Lee. And as a byproduct of this sampling, standard kick sample, he was finding leeches in the river, and he decided to post them to me so that I could give him some IDs for his site species list, and so that I had some specimens. And when going through the specimens, I noticed that some of them looked a little bit odd. So I sent them over to Craig, and he is much more experienced at microscope ID than I am. And he was able to determine that they are in fact a species new to the UK, which is this Barbronia werberei. Now, this species does appear in Elliot and Dobson's Key, because once in, I think it was 1970, a single specimen was found in the UK inside a greenhouse, but it was never found in the wild. So these were officially the first records of this species being found in the wild in the UK, and they dated from March 2024. Subsequently, we have found additional specimens from the same site, and we're hoping to explore this more in the coming years. But it's fascinating that we've found another new species to the UK, and this species could have been overlooked for quite a while. Now, it looks similar to some of our other, to some of our Earthworm days. However, it's a completely new family to the UK. And it's actually a leech from southeastern Asia. So it's known to have spread to Australia, South America, and Southern Europe. But because it looks so similar to some leeches we already have in the UK, it may be that it's been here for a while and it's just been overlooked. So unless you're looking at it under a microscope, you could easily mistake it for something else. But the main differences with this leech is that the eye arrangement is different. So it looks like an Earthworm, and these are leeches that have 8 eyes, so 4 pairs. However, this leech only has 3 pairs of eyes. Another key difference is that werberei has 2 genital paws and 2 additional accessory paws on the dorsal side. So when you look underneath, it looks like it has the appearance of 4 genital paws, which hopefully you can pick out in this picture here. Now, none of the leeches found in the UK have this. So as soon as you find a leech, flip it over and see these 4 paws, then it would indicate to you that that's not typical of our leeches, and it would help point you towards Werbury. However, these paws are so difficult to see, it may be that it's been overlooked. But we are hoping to release a short paper on this later this year, and we're hoping that more people will start looking and more records will start coming in. But it's a huge success for the recording scheme. For us to be so early and for it to have found something so interesting is great, and both myself and Craig are very happy with that. The recording scheme hasn't just led to new leeches, it's also led to new opportunities to talk about leeches. So for example, I'm here tonight trying to convince all you earthworm lovers to also love leeches. But we've also had more publicity this year with Harry Hill. So back in, I think it was April, we were invited onto Harry Hill's Are We There Yet podcast, and we got to spread the word about leeches even further. Coming up, we also have another opportunity to talk about leeches with the Biological Recording Company. So this is the company that Kieran runs, and we'll be doing an Ent-to-Learn specifically on field identification of freshwater leeches for those that would like to learn more and hopefully go out into the field and start submitting records. So far, we're deeming the recording scheme a success, and we're hoping that we can recruit more people to submit leech records so we can just grow and grow with what we know in the UK. So thank you very much for listening. The email address for the recording scheme is pictured on this slide. And if you would like to check out the website, it is still a work in progress, but we're updating it each month and it's getting better and better. And that is leechrecordingscheme.co.uk. Thank you very much.
Yeah.